Hey everyone, welcome back to Future Thinkers. Today our guest is Jim Rutt. Jim is a systems thinker, host of the Jim Rutt Show podcast, and former key player in several technology companies. He also used to be the chairman of the Santa Fe Institute, where he was working in the scientific study of consciousness and evolutionary artificial intelligence. We had Jim as a guest on the show about a year ago, where he did an introduction to the concept of GameB and talked about the history of the movement. You can find that episode at futurethinkers.org/105. And obviously a lot has happened in the world since then, and we wanted to catch up with Jim about some of the ways that concepts of GameB are being applied in practice. Before we begin, here's a brief description of what GameB is.
So if Game A is the current Western civilization status quo, then Game B is a new civilization-level social operating system that at least hundreds of millions of people can live in. So it's not something just for elites or outliers, but it also doesn't imply that this has to be the default operating system for the whole world. Game B is something that doesn't yet exist. It's what perhaps comes next. And we can guess some of the principles of what Game B might be like. It's self-organizational rather than top-down. It's network-oriented rather than individualist. It's decentralized rather than centralized. And it's metastable, meaning that it's evolving but not volatile. And finally, it's oriented towards human flourishing. And I would add that it should also be oriented towards the flourishing of non-human life as well. Earlier this year, Jim published a great Medium article called A Journey to Game B, which lists a lot of practical steps for transitioning into this new social operating system. And we mentioned this article quite a few times throughout this episode. To get the show notes from this episode, go to futurethinkers.org/133. And to learn more about the Future Thinkers Smart Village project, go to futurethinkers.org/village. All right, let's do this.
All right, Jim, welcome back. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Glad we're getting a chance to talk with you more. We just did the podcast episode with you last week, was it? Something like that. And I always enjoy these conversations. So today we're hoping to talk to you a little more about GameB, ProtoBs, and some of the projects you're working on now.
Yeah, so sounds great. Love to do it. Certainly enjoyed having you guys on the Jim Rutt Show a couple of weeks back, and look forward to having our conversation today. Always interesting.
Cool. So the last time we talked on Future Thinkers was at least a year ago. Maybe it was longer. I'm kind of wondering what's happening in the world of GameB. What's new since we chatted? What's going on in the last year?
I would say that the biggest new thing is increased attention to the practical and the real, and less emphasis on theory. Yes, there are still plenty of people working the theory, and that's a good thing. But my strong sense is that where the energy in the community today is moving towards an increasing rate to actually doing things. ProtoBs, which are the idea of on-the-ground communities of various sorts, various forms, in various places, and GameB Ventures, the idea of business entities set up specifically to use the GameB operating system ideas as their basis, and yet be able to outcompete Game A at its own game, so-called parasitizing Game A.
Cool. Very interesting.
And I would say there is a closely related idea called Civium, which is also in the GameB orbit, which is essentially ProtoBs with some additional interesting ideas added to it. And I totally endorse the Civium extensions as one possibility for ProtoBs.
Cool.
Yes, and this is Jordan Hall's ideas.
Correct. And he and I have had some very intense discussions lately, and he and I are jointly designing an economic/monetary system for Civium.
Very cool.
Love to hear about that. In fact, that's the conversation we just wrapped up before we jumped in with you today. What does the economic system look like in a GameB society?
Yeah, and truthfully, we don't know the answer yet. But we have some principles. I think some of the key principles are we certainly have to get away from the game theoretic hyper competition, which the Game A ecosystem produces, where we all are involved in a race to the bottom or to screw each other, and not in a good way, et cetera. And so how do you diffuse game theory dynamics? When by definition, game theory is what you do when you have a certain kind of game. So you have to have a different kind of game with different ways of keeping score that don't produce these, race conditions essentially, where society just wants to drive itself over a cliff and has no sense of limits, no sense of what it's trying to optimize, other than what I would describe the GameA world as trying to optimize short-term money on money return and nothing else. In a GameB system, other values have to predominate over money on money return. Not to say that economic reality can be ignored. It can't be, but it can't be the only value.
Yeah, we were just talking about, how do you measure merit and whether meritocracy is the right way to go, because a lot of the Western societal systems are built on meritocracy, or at least the illusion of meritocracy. And I've been thinking about this a lot. There are certain very valuable things that are just not accounted for in that kind of system. For example, the relationship between a mother and a child. And, how do you support that in a healthy way? A society where a mother has to choose between breastfeeding and working for money is a deeply sick society in my mind. But in a meritocratic society, there's no problem with this. You just
Yeah, well, at least in the definition of merit, where it means optimizing short-term money on money return, for sure.
yes.
And I would say that is a perfect example of the brokenness of our society. And at least my version of ProtoBs, and I would also speak for Jordan here, he and I have talked about this very explicitly, the center of the design has got to be for young families of children. And the ecosystem for raising children to be excellent citizens of the future, and not in ways that don't destroy the opportunities for women in particular, and allows communities of women and men to work together to create a good environment to be parents and to raise wonderful children. And any society that doesn't have that at its core of values is probably very wrong-headed.
I would never have really deeply understood this until after having our first kid and recognizing how those priorities have shifted and how that is so central to the development of a civilization. That how you raise and educate the next generation is where all the change happens. Yeah, it's I really appreciate that that's at the center of your model here.
Yeah, that's that's been at the center of my model for a very long time. It's been recently reinforced. I'm a new grandfather, so it gives me yet another generation I have to worry about, making sure that the systems hold together for them. And I think this is of the essence of it. And I think it's actually one of the problems of some forms of social change movement where there's an overrepresentation of single young people, and they're what they think are important, if they haven't stopped and thought about it deeply, might be having fun, hooking up with the right people, not being oppressed by the man. Those are all useful things when you're 23, but when the time comes to settle down and have a family and replicate the human species in the next generation, those things become secondary compared to the main mission that the human race has got to put on family life, education, and acculturation for the next generation, an opportunity for the next generation.
It really makes you wonder how the political and activism debates and conversations would shift if there were more parents taking part in the conversation instead of single young people.
Absolutely. And truthfully, part of that has been a demographic transition. My mother got married when she was 20. My wife got married when she was 22. These days, the typical age for a woman to get married is about 29, something like that. And so the children are coming much later. And so there's a much longer period of playing the single social game than there used to be. In fact, go back further in time, mothers having children when they're 16, 17 was not at all atypical, and younger than that was not uncommon. And so I think that's, I would argue, a somewhat unfortunate side effect of this demographic transition towards much older childbearing that produces a disproportionate amount of activist voice from people who are not yet focused on this most important aspect of how we organize our society. I don't know what the answer is. There's something to be said for waiting till you're older to have children. On the other hand, there's something lost as well.
Well, feeling the pressure of it, and for us waiting so long, it really had to do with our economic situation, how well prepped we felt we were to be able to guide our child through what's going on in the world now. And obviously a lot of that's just like grasping for control. You never know how you're going to be able to guide them through it, but the financial stability, I think, is something a lot of young people share. They just don't feel like they can possibly afford it.
Yeah, and exactly. Brett Weinstein coined the expression in the very earliest GameB days, cultivated insecurity. Truth is, in any Western society, you probably aren't going to starve to death, right? One way or the other, you'll probably survive. But you've gotten these expectations of how you're supposed to live that if you don't have that, provides a cultivated insecurity. And of course, there's real insecurity. I mean, at least in the United States, you could end up on the street. Now, if you have any social capital, you'll end up in on somebody's couch. But that kind of insecurity is not really suitable for raising children. And in my A Journey to GameB, the essay I wrote about a lot of this that's on Medium, one of the things I laid out is if you're a member of a GameB, ProtoB, you will never be homeless, period. Right, that's a commitment that the community will make to you, that so long as you're a member in good standing of the community, you have a place to live no matter what happens to you economically. And that applies to your children as well. And that's the way it used to be. I remember one of my father's brothers was a bit of a ne'er-do-well, drank way too much, occasionally get in trouble with the law. And, he'd have a place to live for a while, and then he'd be living in my grandmother's attic for a couple of years. It used to be we took care of people. Families, extended families took care of people. But now with everybody atomized to the four winds, one of the things would be great to ask your audience is how many of you live within an hour's drive of where you grew up? And I suspect the answer is not a whole lot. And so that rooted extended family as a fallback is gone. And I think that's one of the things that we're looking at with ProtoBs is to replace the security, the fallback security of an extended family, hopefully without some of the neurotic shit that comes with extended families, as a place where people can feel, even from a young age, that they are secure, that they and their children will always have a place to live and always have food.
Yeah, so that's actually a great way to talk about this. What are some of the kind of minimum viable features of a ProtoB community in your mind?
That's a good question. And I will say that I am a great believer in high dimensional exploration of design space. So anything I say is just my goddamn opinion, and people shouldn't take it too seriously. And they should, if they think I'm full of shit, go try something else. Because I do believe the whole ProtoB movement should be about trying different configurations and figuring out what works. But to at least one form of ProtoB that's co-located on a physical piece of property, I would expect that the minimum constituents there are housing, food, and childcare as essentially the minimum. And childcare, it doesn't seem like it's as obvious, at least in the United States, as the other two. But one of the historical predecessors I studied carefully is the Israeli kibbutz. And something they did that was just sort of fundamental to their operating system is that childcare is a built-in service in the kibbutz. There are people who provide childcare. They're paid the same, by the way, as an engineer or a lawyer. So being a childcare professional is not a second-class occupation on an Israeli kibbutz, at least in the original Israeli kibbutzes. And so that, if a mother chooses or a father chooses as their line of work something that isn't necessarily highly congruent with childcare, there is a very solid provision of childcare built into the operating system of the kibbutz. And certainly in the ProtoBs that, I would like to see that part of it. I think pretty much everything else is up for grabs, but you should always have a roof over your head, food, and childcare.
Yeah, some of the things that you also talked about in your Journey to GameB article are the sort of core assumptions of a GameB civilization in general, which is that it's probably going to be decentralized rather than centralized. It's network oriented rather than individual oriented. It's metastable, meaning that it's even though it might evolve over time, there are some sort of core principles that persevere rather than it being self-terminating in some way.
And
And
self-organizing is a key one.
yes,
And so if we want to go into essentially the values of GameB, those are exactly it. And you could describe self-organizing as essentially a new kind of governance. We really need to learn how to govern in a way that's not top down. So much of Game A is, we go to school, we have a teacher telling us what to do. We go to work, we have a boss telling us what to do. And I think the core vision of Game B is not that we have to learn to cooperatively manage each other and manage as a group. Doesn't mean someone isn't a boss for a while for some task, right? I call task-oriented leadership versus position-oriented leadership. So if we're out, planting watermelons, the person that knows the most about how to plant watermelons gives guidance to those of us who know less about planting watermelons. While if we're building a barn, the person that knows more about building a barn is the one that will be the leader on that day and for that project. And so I think those are essentially some of the fundamentals. And then, other fundamentals in terms of values, and I think this is very, very critical and should be part of the deep design of anything that wants to call itself a ProtoB, is we have to be attempting to minimize our footprint on the earth. I think I called out in that article that every ProtoB should do a regular greenhouse gas audit, for instance, and an honest one on, all right, what is our impact on how we're doing things? Can we do better? To what degree are we depending on grid-based electricity versus our own PV? By the way, photovoltaics are less straightforward than you think. To buy and build the photovoltaics is actually a gigantic cost of energy, which takes 4 or 5 years to pay back. So you'll get a big bump up in your greenhouse footprint the first year you put in PV, and then it'll go way down the second year, and then the two will cross to where you were with respect to grid-based electricity 4, 5, 6 years, depending on electric rates and the fuels that are being used where you live. And so it needs to be a full, deep, multi-dimensional audit. If you live in Iceland and most of the electricity is being generated by geothermal, then you probably don't want to spend money on PV.
mm-hmm.
The fact that Iceland's far north and has cloudy winters, another reason you probably don't. And so, it can't just be feel good. Oh yeah, photovoltaics, always good. Well, good in many cases, but not in others.
Mm-hmm. And another factor that you talked about is, at least in your personal opinion, that these communities should be focused on human flourishing.
Yes, that should be the fitness function rather than money on money or return. And each community, by the way, should adopt its own view of what human flourishing means. And this is an area where even if people are using somewhat similar economic and social operating systems, they really ought to, by some form of consensus process, define what does human flourishing mean. Does it mean self-actualization, which is kind of an individualistic perspective? Does it mean high social coherence, which is another possibility? Or my favorite, which I don't remember who came up with this, but they steered me to it in a debate, which is self-actualization, which actualizes itself as building high coherence community, which increases human self-actualization. So we operate at both levels simultaneously. Now, those words sort of make sense, but you need to go from those words to some actual architecture and some way of measuring in a community that you're actually achieving some vision of that sort in your community. And so every design decision ought to be made with human flourishing, however one defines it, as what guides the decision making.
That's actually a big deal here. Governance, human decision making, consensus. I mean, you've got a fair amount of experience with this, and there's been a public demonstration of it with the GameB Facebook group, and kind of having bad actors come in, and then how you guys have dealt with it has been very interesting, and I appreciate the way you've approached it. So how do you, what kind of techniques, what do you do to reach group consensus and sense making?
Unfortunately, the tools that we have aren't the greatest these days, and that's an area where I personally would like to see a lot more investment, and an area where I hope personally to be able to contribute is to be able to build good governance tools. And in fact, one of our GameB spin-out communities is called GameB Governance as a Service. Which is a pointer, at least, to an effort that needs to be done, so that when people want to launch ProtoBs or GameB ventures, they don't have to invent all this stuff themselves from scratch. On the other hand, these frameworks need to have a fair amount of flexibility so that people can choose different parameter settings for how they choose to do governance. The GameB group exercise was kind of interesting, illuminating, educational, and frustrating all at the same time, because the tools that Facebook provides for a group are very minimal in terms of dealing with bad actors, reaching consensus, et cetera. And so we had to build a whole bunch of kind of side processes to deal with it. And I wouldn't say that by any means our processes were optimal. But as you said, we did come to some decisions and we did act. The part that I don't like about how we did it was that they that did it were the administrators, which is a group of 7 or 8 of us that have, truthfully, I started the group. And so I am so-called a lead admin, which gives me certain powers under the Facebook architecture, one of which is appointing admins and firing admins. And so I just invited a couple of people initially when I went on one of my periodic 6-month Facebook sabbaticals, which I do every year. I appointed Jordan Hall and Sharon Lewis as co-admins in my absence. Those were the first non-me admins, and they added some structure and some process. And then we had in early 2020, we added 2019, I guess. We added some more admins, and we just kept adding them. But the problem is there's no principled democratic way to add or subtract admins. And I would very much like, if I were to do something as crazy as to design the replacement for Facebook and Twitter, which I occasionally think about doing at 3:00 in the morning, I would build it from a governance first perspective. And say, for instance, something like a Facebook group, once it got past, say, the Dunbar number of 150, I would like to see a democratic mechanism by which the admins are appointed to a finite term, and they either get reelected or elect somebody new. And I think that would frankly help a lot, because there was some legitimate criticism. Who are you 7 people to decide who to boot? And we go, well, unfortunately, there's no other way. We can't really have a discussion with 2,500 members. That's not going to work. The only other body that exists is the admins, and we're the ones that have the de jure power as granted to us by the Facebook platform. Because that's the other thing to realize, that these platforms, code is law. It's quite interesting. There's this very complicated emergent law that comes from the powers of admins and moderators and lead admins, and they can go to war with each other. It's like something like Game of Thrones in theory. We've always managed to avoid that in the GameB world, but it could happen. I've seen it happen in other groups. And thinking that thing was not thought through. Whoever designed it for Facebook, it was clearly an afterthought. And I think it would be hugely wonderful to have a group architecture for multi-group architecture where governance was brought in from the beginning. I'll give you an example. This is something I was talking with Jordan about the other day when he and Vanessa stopped by our farm for a while for us to catch up and chat. Wouldn't it be nice if groups could establish a set of rules? The GameB group does have a set of rules, like 10 or 11, something like that. And if you wanted to ban a post or boot a person, but let's just say ban a post, which happens much more often than booting a person, an admin might tag the post, or maybe even any user might tag a post, violates rule 3, no spam, right? Even on the GameB group today, more often than you'd think, somebody comes in and posts some obviously self-serving spam pointing to their, expensive meditation app or something. Bing, and we ping it right off. But it would kind of be nice if it wasn't just us doing that. Instead, someone would flag it and it would go to a jury, a randomly selected jury of active users. And if 9 out of 12 voted to boot it, it would be booted. I think that would be just an example of whether it would work or not. I think it would, but an example of more emergent, self-organizing, bottom-up, democratic-style governance rather than what we have. And all this kind of thinking applies to how you're going to run a ProtoB. If we look at the kibbutz, again, is the one I found to be the richest model. The original kibbutz were very committed utopian socialists. And they believed that governance should be by the community as a whole. So the only official governing body in the original kibbutzes was the Saturday night meeting after dinner, where all the members talked endlessly and attempted to reach consensus on decisions. And it worked when they were small, but when they got even close to the Dunbar numbers, started to break down, and they quickly realized they needed to appoint committees. They did do some things like had term limits on committees. You could only be on a committee for 3 years oftentimes. There were even some leadership positions that were appointed, like plant manager when they started getting into industry, but again, they term limited them. But they did not think about it in advance. They essentially adapted on the fly, and some did better and some did worse. And they probably, in retrospect, could have invested more in thinking through their governance structure. And it's one of the things I hope the work that we're doing in the ProtoB incubator will lead to at least some paper sketches on governance mechanisms for ProtoBs.
Yeah, this has been a hot conversation topic in our family recently with the U.S. elections, and we are having another election in Canada right now, actually in British Columbia. And there's a lot of criticism about the existing system, the representative democracy. So we've been discussing different voting mechanisms and different ways to engage politically that would probably get more people, more young people engaged if they could vote on issues. So I'm curious what kind of tools that you've researched that you think would be an improvement on the existing system, or if you were to rebuild Facebook, what kind of tools would you build into it?
Well, the thing I personally have studied the most and have written about quite a bit, I think I got 4 or 5 essays on Medium on it, on liquid democracy. Liquid democracy is also known as delegative proxy voting. And I've added a wrinkle to it. And this is my version of liquid democracy, which is that, first, what is delegative proxy voting or liquid democracy? The idea is everybody has a vote, and in some absolute sense, we're talking about a direct democracy where, in theory, everybody could vote on every issue. The reality, however, is that most people don't have the expertise, the time, or the interest to vote on every issue. So you can delegate your vote to somebody else. And in my version of it, I added issue areas where there can be an arbitrary number of issue areas that are set up, and each person can even have a different set of issue areas in which they divide their proxy up. So let's say, for instance, I'm in the United States, and we're talking about liquid democracy at the nation state level. I might proxy my vote on healthcare to my doctor, my vote on education to my very favorite 5th grade teacher, and I might proxy my defense vote to my uncle, who's a retired Air Force colonel, but a pacifist nonetheless. So he's both knowledgeable but not a war hawk. I might proxy my environmental vote to the Sierra Club, and I might proxy my gun control vote to the NRA. God damn it! People would say, "God damn, there's no political party that is anything like that." And I go, "Exactly. Here I have been able to represent how I want my votes allocated in ways that aren't necessarily attracted to a polarized single dimensional system. The Anglo-Saxon world has done pretty well for itself in terms of governance. However, it has introduced one bad idea, and that's the first past the post election concept, where, especially for the legislature, whoever gets the most votes wins, and that dynamic of that ends up typically with a two-party system that are polarized left and right, when in reality there's many, many, many more dimensions, right? And I'm a good example of it. I don't fit into either of those parties. I feel like I'm orthogonal to both. And liquid democracy allows you to represent who you are in as many dimensions as you choose to participate in your delegation. Further, as I said, it's also direct democracy. So let's say, for instance, in the United States, it's 2003, and the vote's coming up. Should we go to war in Iraq? And I've delegated my vote to my uncle, but I don't quite trust him on that one. And so I can vote on any individual issue I want, and it overrides my delegations. So if I periodically see something really important, I can say, let me put my foot down on that one, God damn it. And it overrides any delegations I might have made. Further, I can revoke any delegations at any time and either bring them back to myself or delegate them to somebody else. Like, damn, Uncle Charlie's getting awful hawkish in his old age. Let me delegate to the Quaker Church, for instance, my defense vote. And I can do that whenever I want. And there's never any elections. That's the other cool thing about it. So there's no just blinding, screaming bullshit that is, partisan elections in almost every place in the West that has them. And that's why they call it liquid. It's constantly flowing and changing, and there's obviously a national conversation about topics, but there's no cut and dried election that causes everybody to scream and yell at each other for 6 months, or in the United States for 2 fucking years. God damn it, right? And so I think liquid democracy is well worth looking at, and I'd love to see it tried at the ProtoB level. I do warn in my essays that I would not try it at the nation state level until it's been tried at smaller levels. Because it sounds good on paper, but as a complexity science guy, one of the things I know is that the ability to predict with certainty the unfoldings of high dimensional complex social systems is small. And so experiment at low cost, see what happens. If it works, scale it up. Turns out to be a shit show, get rid of it. And I would say liquid democracy it fits in that category. I'm very, very hopeful that it has a tremendous amount of pluses of the sort that I laid out, but it might have some unanticipated side effects. Maybe it's fertile ground for sociopaths. I don't know, but I think that in the right place, it could be good. Some of the other tools that are talked about are ranked choice voting, rather than voting for one person for, let's say, a legislative seat. You can vote for any of them that are running and rank them in order. And there's a mechanism, an algorithm for how your votes are counted. Essentially, your first choice vote counts first, and then everybody's first choice votes are tabulated, and the bottom candidate with the least votes gets kicked out. And then all those people's second choice votes go back into the system. And then the person with the least vote gets kicked out. And then the third or the next choice, which could be their second or third choice votes, flow into the system until somebody reaches a majority. That allows much more room for minority parties, multiple candidates from different perspectives. But to my mind, it still ends up with one setting, unlike liquid democracy, which allows each person to set their own high dimensional configuration of what they like in choice space. Another variant for elections is called range voting, which let's say you get 10 votes for the legislative seat, and you can put all 10 on your favorite candidate, or you can spread them across multiple candidates, and you just add the scores up, and whoever wins, wins. There's theoretical arguments between the proponents of ranked choice and range choice voting, and I have not done enough research to come up with a solid principle on that. But those are two other tweaks to the representative democracy model that isn't as radical as liquid democracy. And let me add one of my favorites, and this might be perfect for ProtoBs. A guy named Forrest Landry, who's a very interesting thinker in the GameB space. I had him on my podcast once, and I just finished an episode with him a week ago, and he's going to come back again in a month. So maybe two more times. And he's got a very cool idea, which is a group should start, and it will only work for a small-ish group. He believes it could work for 50, maybe. He's unsure about 150. But let's assume it would work for a ProtoB in the early stages. And that is that the entity falls into consensus first. And the only thing that consensus does is it defines an executive function. And that could be committees. It could be a way how committees reappoint themselves, et cetera. Includes the personnel, who are the first members of the committees, et cetera. And then when the consensus process is done and the consensus is reached on the executive function, the consensus disappears and the executive does its thing. And the only democratic feature left is the red button, as I call it. I don't know if Forrest likes the red button, which is at any time, a majority of people can say that we want to cancel the current executive, press the red button, in which case the executive is dissolved on the spot and the entity goes back into consensus with the only goal as to define a new executive.
Cool. Yeah, that's interesting.
It is interesting. I mean, it's hyper democratic at one level because it requires consensus to build the executive, but then the executive is not democratic at all because it requires no democratic approval of anything that it does. However, it's disciplined by the red button, and so in some sense it avoids the screaming and yelling of partisan elections. It's another way, the same way liquid democracy does not have partisan elections. The Forrest Landry system also avoids that. And again, I think it's the kind of idea that'd be worth testing by some group. And one of the reasons I hope there to be multiple ProtoBs trying different governance mechanisms so that we can see what does work and educate each other horizontally on, hey, this worked, this didn't work, this sort of worked, all right? And then the next group of people that want to build a ProtoB can pick and choose of what we've seen and what we've experienced.
So one question that comes up for me is we talk about ProtoBs, and it seems that there's a lot of similarities with, kibbutzes or intentional communities, but what is actually something that makes them different?
Well, I think they fit into the broad category of intentional communities. They're a kind of intentional community. And at least, again, my perspective, compared to, say, some of the traditional American intentional communities, and Israeli kibbutzes too, which were very doctrinaire and often isolated from their wider communities. My flavor, at least, of ProtoB, and one of the parts of the design space is how open or closed do you want your ProtoB to be? And I'd argue in the early days, you want it to be pretty open. You don't want everybody to be working on the ProtoB only. Lots of people work out in jobs in the community or work remotely. I've strongly encouraged in my article, for instance, that maybe the ProtoB offers a charter school, which is open to the community. I strongly encourage simple things like members of the ProtoB should be members of the volunteer fire department, and they should be part of the county fair planning committee, and they should have a softball team that plays in the rec leagues, and it should be open to the community rather than closed. And again, I think that also is a good prophylactic against one of the historical failure modes of intentional communities, which is capture by gurus or cult leaders. Mm-hmm. And I talk quite a bit in my essay about trying to build an immune system against cult leaders or gurus trying to take control of the community, a known failure mode on those. The same applies for things like how self-sufficient do you want to be on food? I think a lot of that depends on where you're at. If you're in a place with great agriculture, then it may be sensible to be significantly self-reliant on food. If you're in inner city Detroit, probably less so. And a place like mountains of British Columbia, probably somewhere in between. And so just be practical. Don't be doctrinaire. Don't be ideological. I think that's, to my mind, one of the things that would differentiate us from many exemplars of at least American and also the Israeli kibbutz movements. Be practical, pragmatic.
Yeah, it seems that another way that ProtoBs might be different is the knowledge sharing across different ProtoBs in the network component.
Yep. And I will say the Israeli kibbutzes were pretty good at that. They had 3 different styles of kibbutz, and the 3 different styles had associations. And they did share information across within their associations. So the associations competed with each other. And they also had an association of associations, but those were mostly screaming matches. But we certainly like to steal and extend very considerably the idea of horizontal communications of what works and what doesn't work. The original GameB name for that was something called X in a Box. It's a weird name. It has some historical resonance why it was called that. And the idea is that people in ProtoBs or really anywhere in the GameB world that find something that works should document it and put it in a place where other people can find it and take it and extend it. And we called it X in a Box. I think it was based on Kraft macaroni and cheese originally, where, Kraft macaroni and cheese, we've all eaten lots of it. And once we got older and about 9, we didn't like it just the way it was. We added our own ingredients to it. So, think of, let's say, a governance system. Here's the X in the box. Here's the Kraft macaroni and cheese governance system. Let's open it up. It's okay, but let me add some hamburger and a little bit of real cheese to it, and it'll be better. And so I think that's important. The Civium idea that Jordan Hall's been working on takes that a step further. And some of the work he and I are now doing on economic and monetary systems for the Civium could see the physical on the ground communities being linked with live relationships around things like ventures. For instance, the venture could easily exist on multiple ProtoB locations and could be embedded in a Civium economic operating system that makes the boundaries between the ProtoBs as almost non-existent, particularly when it comes to cooperating on businesses. And I also long encourage that when ProtoBs do set up, that they encourage movement amongst ProtoBs, because one of the things people are going to find is the first community they live in may not be right for them. It may be that the social norms that evolve, hopefully bottom up, but nonetheless don't feel right. And that's okay. If there's multiple ProtoBs and you say, well, this one over here sounds a little bit more like my cup of tea, then we ought to have relatively low barriers for people to migrate from one ProtoB to another. Further, if we have many ProtoBs, some of them are going to fail. We can pretty much count on it. And we should have a culture of accepting refugees from other ProtoBs, though every ProtoB needs to have its acceptance criteria. And while we may give a plus vote for a migrant or a refugee from another ProtoB, we still should not accept people that don't fit within the cultural norms of any given ProtoB. So there's a bit of balance there, pragmatism.
I kind of wanted to jump back a little bit into the liquid democracy subject, because that one's been particularly interesting for me. And I'm looking at ways that system breaks down. And one thing that someone brought up to me recently is the problem with buying votes. How do you deal with that?
It's a good question. Let me think about that. I did think about this once before. Well, here's the answer. It's unfortunately, it may be less of an issue. It may be more feasible at the ProtoB level than the nation state level. Let's take the United States. It's a hell of a lot easier to buy 435 congressmen than it is to buy 150 million voters.
Right.
And so actually the current system is way more susceptible to being bought than a liquid democracy system is. And you could argue that, well, your proxies could be bought. Well, there's going to be hundreds of thousands of proxy holders probably. So again, from a practical perspective at the nation state level, while not perfect, it's a lot better than the current representative democracy, where it's a very small number of people that can either be bought, blackmailed, their kids given fancy jobs, what have you. So I'm less worried about it at the nation state level.
That's a good point too. And if you're going to bribe or coerce people at that level, you're going to end up being very public about it anyway.
Exactly. Hey, you can't buy off 150 million people, or even 5 million people, or even 50,000 people without the word coming out. In a intentional community, I expect the answer is that it would be damn close to impossible to do without somebody finding out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Again, it's a gossipy, close-knit community. Would you risk it? All it takes one person to defect and you'd be thrown out. Mm-hmm. And one person could pretend to play along with you, record what you're saying, and post it on the community bulletin board. So I would say that probably the answer is that the community should be educated that this is a potential failure mode, and it's all of our duty to be aware and to report any such attempt. And it should be considered in the bylaws a death penalty infraction. Anyone that tries to do that should be expelled.
Do you think anonymity plays a role in a liquid democracy setup?
My view is no. I believe that everything should be on the record.
Interesting. Okay, what about being pseudonymous? So
no.
Really? Okay.
Nope.
What if it's verifiable in code but not checkable?
I know all about this. I've gone down the rat hole of pseudo-anonymity with all the blockchain boys. I have long conversations with my friend David Brin about it. And my answer is no. That every public action should be on the record.
Interesting.
There should be cutouts for very, very sensitive things like, domestic abuse support groups or disease support groups and things of that sort. But in general, the default should be very strong real name ID. I've been doing this online thing for 39 years now, and I've seen real name and I've seen anonymous. And I've even in one of my companies, I said it got to be pretty big. We had like 1,100 employees. I did set up a anonymous bulletin board, and we had a very useful public forum system that was great, an important part of the system. The anonymous thing broke down into a shit show almost immediately, and we just deleted it.
Yeah.
And so I know it's controversial, particularly amongst the blockchainers. And in fact, one of my objections to blockchain as it's currently promoted is that it encourages anonymity. It claims it's pseudo-anonymous, but I can show you ways to hack the pseudo-anonymity and turn it into functional anonymity relatively straightforwardly. And so I go the other way. If you're ashamed to put your name on it, God damn it, you probably shouldn't do it.
Okay, well, here's a question then. What about vote delegation? Because I would imagine there's behavioral change when you've got all this power, this backing behind you. And what if you wanted to delegate to someone, but you didn't want them to know they have your delegate vote? Is there any use for that in your mind?
It's an interesting question. Never heard that one proposed before. That would be weird. Well, here's the problem. One of the reasons for delegation is you need to delegate to somebody who you know is actually going to follow the issues and vote. And in fact, in my form of liquid democracy, I allow delegation to not-for-profit organizations, not just individuals. So that, for instance, as I said, the Sierra Club for environmental issues, the NRA for gun rights. And I think that's important because the quality of your delegate is important for the emergent sense-making capability of the system. And for them to be willing to put some effort into it, they need to know they have a bunch of votes. If you don't know you have more than one vote, who the hell's going to read the tax bill, right? It ain't going to happen, right?
Yeah, good point.
And so I think it's very important that people know that they have the votes. whether they need to know whose vote they have is less obvious to me. But I think in terms of hygiene, in terms of being an easy way to beat things like vote buying, right? If people have a non-realistic looking group of supporters, you say, that looks like somebody bought these people on the internet. I think radical transparency is a good thing.
Right.
In fact, I'm so goddamn radical. If you gave me my way, I'd make the whole monetary system totally transparent. Now, for the Emancipation Party, I did allow myself to be talked out of that position, and we'd allow a small amount of anonymous money, about $2,000 per person per month. And we figure that if you got vices that cost more than $2,000 a month, then you got a bigger problem. But truthfully, I think it'd be something to be said for every transaction you do being world readable.
Yeah, interesting.
And I know that's the exact opposite of the blockchain people, but hey.
All right, that's it for this part of the episode with Jim Rutt. To get the show notes, go to futurethinkers.org/133. To watch the full episode, become a member at futurethinkers.org/members. Once you're there, you can sign up for our courses, workshops, and in-depth private calls designed to help you increase your sovereignty, resilience, and sense-making ability. To learn more about the Future Thinkers Smart Village, you can go to futurethinkers.org/village. If you like this content, you might want to check out our 7 Ways to Adapt to the Future guidebook. Get it for free at futurethinkers.org/signup. You might also want to check out our Future Thinkers membership area. We have courses there to help you adapt to the changing world, build resilience, upgrade culture and society, and create meaning and purpose in your life. As well, you'll get access to our community, all of our unreleased content, private Zoom calls, live Q&As with guests, workshops and events, and more. Just go to members.futurethinkers.org. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and comment. It really helps out our show more than you know. And if you want more like it, then subscribe and hit that bell icon to be notified of new videos. See you next time.